Division. Got my degree from Central Missouri State University and had a fellowship to Harvard University. But most of all, I've been married to my wife for 45 years, and we have 3 children, 3 girls, and I have a granddaughter. I don't need no boys. I volunteer in the community a lot. I don't, especially with kids, Better Family Life. I'm on that board in Matthew Dickey's Boys and Girls Club. Those are really where I can see I can do some good to help young people.
My name is Etefia Umana, and Chief George is my hero, my personal hero. He's way too modest in terms of giving his credentialing and the things that he did for black firefighters in St. Louis, one of the most conscionable individuals that I've had the pleasure of meeting in life, and honored to be in his presence and to know him. But again, a little bit about me is that I'm a SLU alum. I'm a board chair of Better Family Life Incorporated. I have my lovely, beautiful son is here, Etefia Umana. He's the one that gave out the raffles over there. And my mother, Joetta Umana, is here somewhere in the back. And I'm just a regular brother, just trying to make a difference in the lives of black people.
Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Eric Gardner, and so much more. Their deaths sparked a long overdue national conversation about many things, one of those things including police and community trust. In this conversation, we will discuss whether the demonstrations and unrest that took place in Ferguson after Brown's death could happen here again. What is the role of a citizen? What is the role of professionals? What is the role of elected officials? I would like to thank my panelists personally for being here. The first question I want to pose to you all is, why do you think the people of Ferguson responded in the manner they did after Michael Brown's death? Why do you think this sparked so much controversy across the nation and even the world?
Is that for anyone?
It's open to the whole panel.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll make a quick statement on that. I actually live in Ferguson. I'm about maybe a 2-minute walk from the Quick Trip that burned down and the subdivision that's right behind it. Ferguson is really like 3 cities. You have individuals that are in substandard, subsidized housing. And you have individuals that, after white flight, you had African-American individuals that live in just housing that's there, and then you have a more rich area that's in Ferguson as well, where you have a significant amount of white Americans there. And the issue in terms of why I think it erupted is because of you have citizenry that's a black mega majority. So you have about 67% of the population that's African American. But if you're looking at the elected officials that are there, if you look at the fire department, if you look at the police department, you have a situation where it's predominantly white, where individuals that were very insensitive to African Americans that almost occupied the area as if they were criminals, more so than protecting and serving them, were there as well. And unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that it's only going to be so long where, like, let's say, for example, the hit rate all throughout America for contraband is twice as much for white Americans as it is for black Americans, but black Americans, African Americans are pulled over significantly more, searched. You have the illegal search and seizures, all those kinds of things, Fourth Amendment violations, just dehumanizing conditions that are prevalent in African American communities. And it's only so long where you can be treated as subhuman individuals, where you're economically disenfranchised, where you don't have a certain political apparatus, where you don't where the services in the community aren't working for you, where a situation is destined to spark up. And that's essentially what happened. And those conditions realistically have not changed significantly in the community. And that's my take on it, being a Ferguson resident.
Wait, before I start, can I make a request real quick?
Sure.
So for the people in the audience, you guys are kind of sporadically dispersed. Can y'all kind of come in? Yes, no? If you're able to move, please. I promise I don't bite. Okay, good. So my take on that, like why was the response the way that it was, in addition to the microaggressions that were already mentioned, I think when we talk about the reaction to Ferguson and reaction to the murder, the murder of Mike Brown, we must keep in mind that the initial reaction, it was never a movement, it was mourning. People came there, you know, flowers, teddy bears, just, you know, crying, praying, comforting each other. That's really what happened. But the issue was the heavy-handed response of the police. I think Ferguson is what happens when black people, when we come together and we're crying and we're praying and we're seeking answers, but we were met with these, you know, we were met with weapons, we were met with assault rifles, we were met with dogs, we were met with tear gas. It was just a really heavy-handed response. And so naturally the reaction, the organic reaction that took place in the Ferguson neighborhood, it was just a response to the violence that they endured. And people hate when I say this, but I think that if the police response was different to how that community mourned and how that community was trying to heal in that moment, honestly, I don't think that there would be a Ferguson protest. I don't think that there would have been a Black Lives Matter movement now. I think that it was all about how the police responded to our mourning.
I've thought about it a lot, and I'm not sure why I'm on the Civic panel, so some of my things will come from a faith-based. But I think it was almost like that saying of the straw that breaks the camel's back. There comes a time and a point in history that nobody can pinpoint where people are tired. And when they're tired, they eventually say enough is enough. And I know this is often clothed in civil rights, 2.0, or it's not, but it is. There's a point. If we think about it, Rosa Parks just got tired, and her tiredness sparked a movement. I think that Ferguson is just a microcosm of many communities within the United States, and I think that's why what happened eventually didn't stay confined to Ferguson, didn't stay confined to St. Louis, but made its way through the nation as people in very similar neighborhoods began to say, we're tired too. And it just became an awareness. I think the hashtag for a long time was stay woke. People woke up and they said, we're not going to be quiet anymore. We're not going to be silent. And it just reminds me of every change that has ever happened in society, whether it's here, whether it's South Africa. And it usually starts with young people who have the courage, because they don't have the baggage that some of us have, to say we're tired. That's what basically happened in South Africa with apartheid. It was the students who said we're tired. But I think it's a moment in history. For me, if it's from a faith base, it's what we call a kairos moment. It's an inbreaking of God that says, okay, let's see what we're going to do to change the systems. And so I don't know that we can pinpoint why. I've thought about, was it the fact that he laid in the street for 4 hours? Was it the fact that his mother could not get to him? The reality is that was not the first time that ever happened.
That's right.
It wasn't the first time. So what made it different? It was just a moment in time, and all of the pieces came together, and we eventually have a movement that spread across this nation.
Okay. Well, I think the involvement of young people changed everything. When young people said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think they just had enough and started to deal with it. How do you justify anyone, any police officer, or anyone who has the power to take a life, to come into your money, come into your community, punish you with impunity, to kill you and say, all they have to do is make one statement, I thought my life was in jeopardy. Anytime you hear that, every time, you know there's something wrong with it. You know there's something wrong with it.
That's right.
So the young people were, in my opinion, they made the difference. People of my age, my vintage, were trying to deal with it legally and but it didn't work because the system was working against us. And that's why when Black Lives said change the legal system, that's one of the most important things that we can get done, to change the legal system, because it's putting too many of our young people away, locking them away, ruining their lives forever. So I just want to right quickly say I'm not just talking out of school. 1987, this is me and my wife. She was beaten by a police officer in Richmond Heights, beaten for no reason. He made a mistake looking at someone else 20 years her junior. There was never an apology. And they say the same thing now, we're just doing our job. Why are you pursuing this? You know, it's just like we shouldn't do that. And fortunately, I had the wherewithal to be able to take it to court. But other than that, some people just don't. So anyway, think of the young people. Actually, the young people who want to make the difference.
You spoke on young people, and a couple of people spoke on the rise of Black Lives Matter. Out of after the death of Mike Brown, even though it started after Trayvon Martin, but it got really big after Mike Brown's death and after Ferguson. I just want to know, what does the goal of Black Lives Matter movement mean to you, and how do you feel you're personally working toward the goal, toward that goal?
Well, initially, it meant simply Black Lives Matter, but after I saw what they were trying to accomplish, how to get change, it had nothing to do about killing or anything other than to change the system. Anything that we've ever gotten has been come through the system, so we have to do it politically, and that's a tough thing to do, because we're only 12% of the population. You know, I heard something earlier talking about voting for the lesser evil, but Mr. Kennedy said the right thing: vote for what's in your best interest.
That's right.
So, but the young people made it, not only made it something that we should focus on, but they focus on another thing. The system has always been around older people, us, saying, well, we're going to keep this down, let's do this, and let's do that. And that's what's happened. Our leadership that we had wasn't doing what we should have, what we expected of them. Our leadership, and that's whoever you want, has actually failed us, in my opinion. And I'm just speaking for me. It's failed us. And the young people said, well, okay, we're going to lead, and here's where we're going. Mm-hmm. And I think they're headed in the right direction. Everything they've done has had a positive impact on change, if you think about what I'm saying. Change. Nothing's been accomplished yet, but it's out there and it's changed. We're looking at change, and I think some of it's going to happen.
Okay. Yeah, personally, in terms of looking at Black Lives Matter or what have you, and I agree with everybody on the panel in terms of like the tipping point that came to cause all of the things that occurred, and the need for continued action and continued struggle. But Black Lives Matter is essentially asserting, and it really trips me out when you have certain aspects of the populace that are trying to say, well, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization. You know, you have individuals that are circulating petitions to make Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization. You all may have heard that. And the reality of the situation is that all we're saying, or you have the other individuals that want to be politically correct and say all lives matter. That's just retarded. All right, and the situation is Black Lives Matter is asserting the fact that there are disparities as it relates to black people and other individuals. There's a difference between black life in America in terms of its dignity, its worth, its value as looked at by the majority population, and white life. It's a difference in terms of mass incarceration. It's a difference in terms of healthcare disparities. It's a difference in terms of police brutality. It's a difference in terms of all of those matters that impact every aspect of our existence. And we do matter. We're just saying we matter. We need to be equal. The things need to be fair. They need to be impartial. That we need to have a stake. And we don't want you to continue to kill us unjustly. You know, and that's pretty much what that means. And it's incredible to me that most European Americans, a lot of European Americans, white folks, can't quite grasp the concept that there are inequalities that exist in this country, that it does have a significant, substantive, and definite impact on all aspects of your life, and that we need to assert our humanity, our dignity, and our rightful place. That's really all it is.
Well, I was just going to add, it's kind of hard to treat Black Lives Matter as like this one entity with this one goal. And the reason why it's like that is because the participants and the leaders, we all have different ideas of what equality and what equity would look like in this nation. I will say one thing I love about this movement is when we say Black Lives Matter, we are not just talking about police brutality anymore. Now we have conversations about the medical system or the education systems, you know, the prison pipeline. Like, we're having these conversations that goes beyond just, well, what happens when the officer pulls the trigger. So that is awesome to have those different conversations. In addition to so the next part of the question was like, well, what should the overall goal be? In my opinion, no matter what the topic of the conversation is, when it's about Black Lives Matter, it's about the fact that we want to be seen and treated as human beings. That's what's happening in this nation, is that people do not see Black people as human beings. We're like this subhuman. This is why when mainstream media, when they release an article that says, well, this Black man ran towards the police officer while he shot 3 bullets in him, see, that's superhuman. That sounds like to people that don't have relationship with Black people and may have I don't know, I may be prejudiced against Black people, it sounds realistic to them. But meanwhile, when you're Black and you live in a Black neighborhood, you know good and well that Black people are not approaching police officers. In fact, we do everything that we can to avoid them. Whether we have a criminal history, whether we have, it does not matter, because we were literally trained from our childhood to avoid police officers at all costs. We were not taught that they were our friends. We were not taught that they were there to help us, because from what we have seen is that they're there to harm us. And this has been going on for centuries, well, decades. Like, as you can see, Sherman George here, like, he pulled out an article from what year was that?
1987.
1987. The issue is not new. It's just that we now have video cameras, so we're recording it.
Right.
And I had something else to say, but I lost my train of thought. It might not be important then if I forgot it. But I'll finish it there. Oh, that's what it was. Also, that as far as like the goals and how we get to liberation and how we get to equality, I was saying how different participants and different leaders in this movement have different ideas. There are some people in this movement, like Pastor Corey Bush and Rasheen. Did they leave?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, like their agenda, their agenda was to get involved in politics, which that's great. Like, we need that. But for someone like me, as far as I'm concerned, this entire system, economically and politically, when it was built, we weren't humans. When it was built, we were literally slaves. We were a means to an end to build up the economic system of America. So for me, someone like me, I don't want to participate as far as becoming a politician. For me, my whole goal with liberation would be, okay, we just need to build a new system, because the reality is the way that this one was created and the way that this one was birthed out, it was that I was never seen as human. That's why it will never work in my favor, and that's the bottom line.
Right. I agree with what everyone has said, and so when you say, what does Black Lives Matter to me, personally, it's hope. It's hope that we can change the system. It's hope that we won't always be at this place. It's hope that my grandchildren would have the ability to grow up in a system that has equity. I don't always say equality because we'll never get to equality, but equity. So equity means what? They have access. They have access to good jobs. They have access to being able to live where they want, right? And not be discriminated against. They have the right to build their own businesses and to be entrepreneurs. I'm looking for equity for my children. And so this movement based out of young people is hope. I think that the problem becomes that we have not been as effective at communicating that there are strategic goals that Black Lives Matter is working towards. They're working to have the criminal justice reform. We are working for ending the school to prison pipeline. I think if we could communicate better that there are actually concrete goals that have been laid out and laid before the powers that be. I think it is a both and. I think there need to be people just like Angel who says, I'm getting ready to create a new system. But you also need people within the system in order to begin to move the old system, and maybe they come together at a certain point and run together. So I think and then it's also baby boomers, i.e. me, and those older than us, to get on board and not to look. The problem I have is that as African Americans, we've been othered all of our lives. The problem I really have is that within Black America, we other each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We other each other. We do it based on class. We do it based on economics. We do it based on educational. We want to say those kids, those are my children. And so we have to learn to get in the fight with them in the ways that we're able to. What I like in the conversations and the actions, I can't necessarily protest all night long. I'm going to walk with you for about 4 or 5 hours, and then, okay, these 61-year-old feet got to go somewhere and sit down. But I may have access in other areas. So some of the organizations I work with, MCU, we actually have a total campaign on breaking the school to prison pipeline. We're looking at criminal justice reform. We're looking at demilitarizing police. We're looking at what is going on with out-of-school suspension, and we've been working hard with the St. Louis Public Schools. So the idea is that we bring all of these gifts, talents, and graces to the table and learn to work together. It's a matter of trying to work youth with adults. Youth have a lot of good ideas and they have the energy, but there's a wisdom with the seniors, and somehow we have to know that we can't do it without one another. We're going to have to learn to do it together. But for me, Black Lives Matter is hope. It's the hope that I have for my grandchildren's future.
Can I clear up one thing?
Yeah.
There was Etefia mentioned that there was a petition going around to make Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization. You know, I don't know about you all, but I don't walk out of my door every day thinking about a terrorist. That's not part of my makeup. I just don't. But I do think about a lot of other things. But I looked up in an article, ABC News did a research. What is terrorism? Anybody see that or look it up? What is terrorism? There's no definition what a terrorist is, according to them. They couldn't find a definition. The FBI had one of someone who violates international law. But the words in the terrorist from the ABC is like, a terrorist is, what is a terrorist to you? Is it the guy that shot 9 people in the church? Or is it the police department that terrorized our communities? Some of us think that the police is being terrorists. Mm-hmm. And so we can't keep defining terrorism over and over again. What is a terrorist? We've seen a lot of killings, and I think those were terrorists, me personally.
That's right.
But to brand Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization is beyond me, and it just shouldn't happen.
I'd like to continue on the many of you guys brought up the recent killings, and basically I want to see, given the recent killings of 2 African American men in Baton Rouge and Minneapolis, and of police in Dallas and Baton Rouge, there's a tendency in the country to be polarized into pro-police or pro-victim of police, in those 2 extremes. How can we form a greater solidarity among all of us in order to stop the killing of often unarmed Black victims and police?
Well, how can we form greater solidarity between whom?
Between us and between the community and the police that not govern, but the police who are in charge of the community.
Well, you know, I think that one of the things that we have to do is kind of take a step back, take a look, do a real analysis about what's going on here. It's not that, I mean, there's a whole all lives matter, black lives matter, blue lives matter. And, you know, the reality of the situation is that we got to keep everything in the forefront of our minds in terms of, for me, it would be, it's not just wholesale, rampant attacks on police. That just doesn't happen. We've had some situations that have happened in Dallas. We had the situation that happened in Baton Rouge. We've had some other situations. But the reality of the situation is numerically what happens all too often because of bias, because of inadequate training, because of systematically disabling body cameras, not following proper policies, not being trained right, is that white police officers have an implicit bias against black people, black males in particular, and they are killing them. That's what's going on, more so than anything else. So I think that the issue more so that it's not, you know, what this wholesale attacks on police that are that the media is trying to propagandize. That's just not realistic. That's not real. That's disingenuous. It's fake. All right. The reality of the situation, if you want to have greater alliance between police and the communities that they serve, number one, they need to start serving the communities. There's some real simple things that can be done. You can have police academies in the African American community. You can have cultural and sensitivity training as a part of while they're in the academies. You can have psychological tests that test for bias over the course of, you know, every 2 or 3 years. You could create a culture where more individuals from the community are reflective of the police force that is reflective of the community composition and makeup. You can have that as well. There are many simple things, but it all comes down to power sharing, sensitivity training, and recognizing the dignity and worth of the community that you serve, more so than anything else, and not trying to sensationalize the whole Blue Lives Matter thing, but really trying to get a healthy respect, dialogue, understanding, as opposed to an occupation of the community that these individuals serve. And that would be a start.
You know, I understand probably more than most people out here that we have great public servants. We have great firefighters, great police officers. But I do know that we have bad police officers. We have bad firefighters. My problem as fire chief, I had a difficult problem separating some of the bad white firefighters. They just didn't want me to do it. And I'm saying it in public, I'll say it, and we can get the records or whatever they want to do. Did not want me to punish some of those people. That was just a fact. And that was one of the hardest problems I had, trying to do things fairly. I didn't just try, I did. But they didn't like that. But let me tell you, what gets us back on track are two things: respect and accountability. And along with that, I think needs to have a different mental test for some people. This one isn't working. I'm saying this because I was a police officer in the service. I was a police officer and I served in Vietnam. Weapons weren't a problem. I had to use them. Carried 3 weapons every day, a .45, a M16, and a shotgun. For a reason, because I had people under my control. People kill people. Sometimes because of fear. Other time it's what's in your head and what's in your heart. And we got to separate that some sort of way. We have to do better at that. It is the most difficult thing in your life to kill another man or person. If you don't understand that, we know we got a societal problem that we need to deal with, and they're not willing to deal with that. We act as if police have a right to kill other people that they serve. That is not a right. I reject that idea. If you recall right quickly, I would say if a young individual was shot in the Compton Heights area. Von Derrick was his last name. Anybody remember that? I was shocked to find out, I believe it was it was in April, I believe, that I discovered through the newspaper, St. Louis American and the Post both, that police were not drug tested after they killed somebody. They weren't drug tested at all. They have a random system and that's it. Now, as the fire chief, that would never would have happened. If somebody killed somebody driving a truck or something just went crazy, I guarantee you that person's going to be drug tested. He or she's going to be drug tested to do what? To say that I'm looking out for the citizens of St. Louis and I'm going to protect the integrity of this department. Those are two reasons I would do that. If there's something wrong, I'm going to take care of it. Do you realize this guy was doing drugs? Anybody know that? Ran into a car, and he found out he was drunk. But here's the problem. I'm a member of the Retired Police Officers Association, too. Before he was drug tested, before the run into the accident, they were telling me this guy was on drugs. They knew. That's a problem. We can't give anybody that kind of power without accountability.
That's right.
Just can't happen. So we need to get that respect back and accountability. And that's what we need.
No, I agree. I think it is respect, it's accountability, but there's also got to be some transparency. When these incidents occur, the entire process of investigation should be transparent, and people should know what's going on. We need to have people who are not a part of the system doing the investigation. I believe that you should have independent counsel on a lot of these, that you can't police yourself.
That's right.
That's just ridiculous. And so I think until the system, because that's really what we're talking about structural issues are addressed, there won't be that coming together of community and policing. There has to be a breakdown in that whole fraternal blue thing that you know something's wrong, but you don't admit it and you don't tell anybody. And some of that's going to have to be the training. Some of that's going to have to be bringing people in who don't mind bucking the system. So I think a lot of it's transparency and accountability. If someone is shot, I mean, I hate to say I'm desensitized to no verdict and no charges, but it's getting to be like that. Every once in a while when they actually charge somebody, I'm in total shock. And it shouldn't be that way. And some of it's going to be relationship building. There are some communities that I've heard and read about that are making a difference because they're doing the very things that we've talked about. They're doing bias training. They're doing neighborhood policing. They were talking about it even in Dallas, that the police department has made a really, big shift. But that's what it's going to take, and it's going to take accountability. And there's going to take some standards. The problem we have in St. Louis is we got 90 municipalities, and they all get to do their own thing.
That's right.
And that's absolutely ridiculous. You have municipalities that have the bad officers because they got fired from one department, and we don't have anything to stop them from moving to the next department.
Yeah, you're right.
And so there need to be some standards. You have standards for teachers. You have standards for almost every occupation. Why are there not minimally required standards for all police officers to meet? And if they don't meet them, then they should not be allowed to be on the streets.
You have about a minute before the Q&A. If you want to answer, you can. But you good?
Yeah, I'll answer. Originally, I didn't have an answer because I feel like the Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter couldn't be in solidarity, just based on my experiences with Blue Lives Matter people. They tend to be unrealistic about the numbers and what the data is actually telling us. I think one thing that we can really unify on is there are police officers that call out their colleagues and they end up fired. And I think that like, if you really care about the lives of police officers, like, and if you're black and you care about having a good police officer to serve the community, I think that we actually can get together and unify on protecting these officers that are calling out their colleagues and they are breaking that blue line. And now, see, I was quick.
Now that puts us into Q&A. The Q&A is about 20 minutes. Does anybody has a question, just go in the middle. Okay.
And you took the words right out of my mouth. The last statement that you made, I just have a comment. There are cops that, and in any profession, we talk about the code of silence in the black community. There is a code of silence in the police department. A lot of cops know, and I'm talking about our own African American cops that have been there forever. They know when things are wrong. They know, they hear. It's just like any job. You can go, you know when something bad has happened in your workplace. So they have to know about all these incidents that are occurring, but no one says anything. So I want to hold them accountable as well. Because I'm of the opinion that if you witness something and you don't say anything about it, you are just as bad as the person who did the crime. So my other comment is holding cops accountable for their crimes. When they do things, they should not have this higher system where they are not charged when they do something wrong. So we need to change all of that. So all of that should be part of the system that, you know, all of this needs to work for the good of everyone. So I'm just hoping that at some point we can see, I mean, I know there are good cops and there are bad ones. And when you're bad, you need to be held accountable just like any other criminal.
Absolutely.
Right. I spoke a little earlier about our use of guns in this country. And it seems like a lot of folks don't really want to face up to that. I think the people in Ferguson, though, you have a unique opportunity with all these watchings going on and the federal government's here. But you know, over in Europe, they have policing models where people don't carry guns. And I think if the police want to gain more of our respect, you might want to follow that line of action. Ask them, maybe they can find some brave policemen that want to go out and maybe be more community coordinators and things like that. Also, I feel really comfortable in here today because I don't think anybody's packing weapons.
Yeah.
If you are, I'm just have to say I'm sorry. You live in that much fear. I've been to a number of conversations here where people come in the rooms with guns on. They're police officers, and I think it just is a testimony to what we tolerate and what we've become accustomed to. I get really uncomfortable when I'm in a room, even with police officers wearing guns. You know, maybe they can search us, frisk us. I'd much rather have that done to go into a room, particularly where the conversations may become controversial. And we have people with guns on. We don't know what medications they're under. We don't know what mental state they're in, what kind of stress they're under, and who can be under more stress than the police officers. Have a lot of passion for them. But it just goes to the testimony of our tolerance of guns and weapons and violence. And I've heard some wonderful testimony today, and thank you for all your work, but I always ask people on many occasions, and thank you, Better Family Life representation here. I've had the opportunity to work with Mr. Clark, and hearing the stories on his Put Down the Pistol program on a Saturday morning, I encourage everyone to come to those on occasion. Getting to the question, though, I've asked, if you're carrying a gun, why? Why are you carrying that gun? And secondly, what will it take for you to put it down? That's all
I'm sorry.
Is this a question for the?
Well, I think he made several statements that probably should be addressed. One of them is thank you for your observations. They're very, very pertinent and very, very real. The reality of the situation in this country is that we have just a very rampant gun culture that exists. I believe that there are enough guns in this country for every individual in this country. If I'm not mistaken, it's something like 350 million guns in the United States of America. And it is totally different from the way it is around the Western world. The United States, for all its assertions of greatness, et cetera, in so many different ways is backwards from a lot of places in the world. And it's one of the things that Terry Kennedy was talking about in terms of like the political models and studying new political models as well. We need to study different cultures in terms of their gun culture and how they handle different issues, even in terms of models of policing, just in general. Because again, imagine if whatever was going on at the Mike Brown situation, that Darren Wilson did not use deadly force, used a taser, used some type of pepper spray, used some kind of disarming situation that did not have to be lethal. But in the minds of those that are policing, and looking at the limitation in terms of the value of black life, the limitation in terms of black dignity, a lot of times we're looked at as expendable just in general. Couple that with the rampant gun culture and you have a recipe for a disaster. So we do need to look at other models throughout the world that have been successful, that don't have such a proliferation of guns, and that we solve our issues with that level of force.
Can I just say the other piece of it is good people have to speak up.
Right.
Every time our president has tried to get gun legislation passed, the polls say that the majority of people are in favor of it. But the majority of people will not go and raise their voices to their representatives and their congressmen and demand that they pass these laws. And so then we don't go and do what? Vote them out. You heard the last panel. The presidency is great, but if you don't vote out the congressman that's working against your good, if you don't vote out the senator that's working against you, if you don't vote out the governor and the state house, we got Jefferson City, we got lots of issues. If we don't go and do that, no one will work. And the people who are against it are not vocal enough. We are fighting against a power machine in the NRA.
That's right.
With tons of money and tons of influence. And a lot of it goes directly to those same people that we need to vote out of office.
Exactly.
And so good people need to raise their voice and demand, because we've distorted the whole narrative of the Second Amendment. It was never in place so that you could
No. You're right.
build up an arsenal.
It wasn't. You're right.
That's not the purpose. There's no purpose for anybody being on the streets with assault weapons and magazines that can shoot 100 rounds in 30 seconds. But if we don't start raising our voices and demanding the change, it's not going to happen.
And while we're demanding the change for gun reform, when we're having these conversations, it's important to always keep in mind that there are certain communities that are more vulnerable to new laws than others. Personally, for gun reform, if people aren't talking to me about disarming the police, I'm not really interested. To be completely honest, and I know a lot of people won't like this, but I personally am a believer in armed resistance. I am. That's just me. However, if we're going to have this conversation about gun reform, it is important to know that being black, matter of fact, everybody on this panel, when those laws are passed, understand that there will be a bigger target on our back. So that's just my piece.
Well, I'm not saying take them all. I am specific about what type of weapons people should be able to have. It's not necessarily your hunting rifle or your pistol. That's not my issue. I'm talking about guns that were produced as
to kill people.
Weapons of war and things that could be taken off the streets. I'm talking about the fact that police should not have militarized war weapons and war machinery on the streets of this country. Yeah. So it all goes together for me.
Yeah, but there's a lot of merit between what both of you all are saying, because one of the things is when you look at the very schizophrenic nature of the United States, it's a very schizophrenic country. Second Amendment rights, you have these yahoos that want the Second Amendment rights. They swear by it. They sleep with their gun. They make love to their guns every night. And the reality of the situation is Second Amendment rights are fine until black people exercise their Second Amendment rights. Then it becomes problematic. Then it becomes a situation where you're going too far. You are a person of interest because you happen to carry a gun in an open carry state.
Right.
You know, so again, when we look at gun laws and we look at the reality of the situation, and then also we have to look at the language in which the oppressive population speaks. It is one of violence.
Absolutely.
It is one of violence, and you're the target because you don't mean anything. You don't matter. You don't have any human worth. You know, so it's a very schizophrenic and very nuanced position that we have to kind of understand. Of course, you know, the assault weapons should be banned. But, of course, people should have a right to defend themselves against individuals that have significant, substantive, very deadly arms that are proliferated almost ubiquitously in this society.
We have another question, and I ask that for these next three questions, these be the last three. These are the last three questions, and for these next three questions, only two panelists answer each question. Thank you.
Hey, Dad. I remember Pastor Anderson earlier was talking about how Ferguson was a result of kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and a lot of that dealt with like resources. And so, I mean, even just quick summary, a name that I think everyone should look up is Harlan Bartholomew. He's very famous in the world of city planning. He did the planning for St. Louis, Newark, Memphis, Chattanooga, litany of cities, late 1800s, early 1900s. And he set up like a lot of the zoning laws and stuff that made like a lot of predominantly black areas not in residential zones. So like, you know, a lot of two-family flats and stuff, predominantly in black neighborhoods. But if you go out into Clayton, you can't see those. And those sorts of large residential homes were made accessible through FHA loans, which were delayed in getting to African American populations, and then thus that's setting off, you know, a lot of difference in where tax dollars go towards education systems, and a lot of redlining is designed to like keep African American peoples outside of those communities. So I guess the question I have to pose to you all is, you know, there's been a lot of historic kind of counter move to inhibit resources, and then kind of like a counter move by the government to slightly expand them. What is the next move that you all feel is the most pertinent to kind of give disenfranchised black communities resources that have long been like deprived from them?
That's my son. That's what's up. All right. So smart, so handsome. All right, anyway, that's a very, very important question. And what Etefia did was he dropped a lot of information in terms of how the conditions, and he does a lot of research on how the conditions came to be as they are right now. It's not by happenstance that you have individuals that are struggling, communities that are struggling and suffering. The individual that he's referencing, he told me about. You know, he did the research and told me about this dude set this up in all of these cities. He lived to be 100 years old, died in 1989, and this is his legacy, basically, the design of cities to where you have some individuals that are thriving, other individuals that are not thriving, and other individuals that are on the margins of society. And famous for planning in a very racist, elitist manner, just in general. But the reality of the situation is if you're talking about what's the next move or what have you, it's got to be, again, you have tree shakers, jelly makers, you have individuals that are going to have to do protests and work within the system, and individuals that are protesting and working outside of the system, just in general. But the reality of the situation is that whatever it is, it has to be very strategic. We have to make sure that, again, we can't sit out elections. We see the consequences of what happened in the last panel. Unfortunately, everybody on the panel that we just saw lost. Every one of them lost. Some of it, you know, again, there's probably some funny stuff going on with that Hubbard thing. Yeah. But nonetheless, to be looking, you don't have like 90% of your absentee ballots go to one candidate. But the reality of the situation is that we've got to make sure that we continue to vote, that we continue to wake up our people, that we begin to support organizations that are doing things in the community, and that we continue to just resist as much as humanly possible and wake people up, wake up institutions like this. Having a conference like this is a first start. It's a good start. Just in general, but this room should be filled to capacity. It should be filled to capacity. You know, but each one teaching one, each one waking one up. You know, and each one making sure that we are supportive of one another economically and otherwise. Those are some good necessary first steps. May seem a little bit nebulous, but the reality of the situation is that we've got to make sure that we're awake and that we're vigilant and that we're constantly, like you just did with your question. Your question was one that was predicated on research and understanding, oh, this is what happened. And once you understand that this is what happened, then it makes it a little bit easier to understand, okay, well, this is what needs to be done.
Anybody want to touch on that really quick, or we move on to the next question?
No, I agree with you. And then I also think we have to hold, so banks get a lot of federal funding, and I think that we need to start really dealing in the financial aspect of it, that with this funding, that they have to begin to make loans in those areas for small businesses, right? Because we need to have some economics. You know, we need to go to these large chains like grocery stores. We got so many food deserts in St. Louis, and saying we're not going to shop with you unless you're going to really look at this area to put some, economics into it. And so I think it's a lot, and it's going to take a concerted effort of everybody. It's working across the board from in the street to the boardrooms in order to make first steps. And then when we get those things in our neighborhoods, we need to support them. I keep thinking of the store that they opened in Baden, the grocery store with fresh foods, and nobody supported it, and
Yours.
It closed.
Yours.
So then we must also change some of our ways of looking and not always take our dollars out of our community, but begin to keep our dollars in the community. And that's not a condemnation. I'm just saying in reality, we have to also do the same things. And some of the local credit unions, learning that we don't have to go to the Bank of Americas. There are a lot of small credit unions that can help you to purchase homes and to start small businesses, and they're looking for that because that's one of the areas that's not real tapped in the underserved communities. And so looking at some other places that we can go and take our dollars.
Thank you for the question.
Hi. I know that there is a lot of, for obvious reasons, there's a lot of hostility, like the inner city among young.
Can you please speak up a little more?
Oh, sure.
And also, can you please get to the question as fast as possible, please?
Okay. What would you say to since there's hostility among a lot of young black men toward the police and maybe the inner city, what would you say and there aren't enough black applicants to become police officers, what do you say to somebody like that to say you should really become a police officer from that area so somebody knows you, so they can identify with somebody who's black? So most of the people who are coming in the area are white.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, and it's very complex, the question, just in general. Now, I hear an individual to my left is saying that that's not the answer, becoming black, promoting the police officer, and that there's some merit to that. But then you have to look at it from several different perspectives. There's some merit to that. The real issue is not, the real issue that we have to kind of look at is making sure that the police are there to do what they're supposed to do, not occupy a community, not exploit a community, but make basically a deal with the devil in terms of having the community be their personal ATMs for municipalities, which often happens when the primary revenue that's generated from these municipalities is extracted from the community that they serve, usually those individuals that have less than just in general. But they actually have some respect. They actually do real community police work, and they see the individuals as human beings. That's one. So don't put it off to a degree on black folk that are being oppressed, that are being dehumanized, that are being marginalized, and saying, well, why can't we have to look at what the real problem is. The real problem is the individuals that are not trained properly, that have psychological deficits, and that look at the people who they serve as inhuman. That's what the real issue is. That's point one. Point two is, if it is better oftentimes if you do have a community makeup, a makeup of your police force like that of the community. I mean, it would be better. It's not in and of itself. It's not like you don't have bad black police officers that look at the community inappropriately as well. You do. But it is a better situation. You can probably have more better relationships. Let's say if you do something similar, say, okay, well, if you're in Ferguson and you're a police officer in Ferguson, you have to live close to Ferguson in terms of a residency requirement. And if you have a black mega majority, more likely than not, and you phase that in over time, your force will look more and more like the fire department will look more and more like the community. Police department will look more and more like the community. You could do that as well. Or you could have a serious recruiting effort in the various communities. And those are some things that just aren't really happening. But I think there has to be a re-examining of the role. And then also your question is interesting because it almost makes it seem as if it's an immutable, and I'm not attacking you, I'm just keeping it real. It's an immutable characteristic that young black males have about police. No, it's not something that just sprang up. It's a justifiable, realistic, reasonable reaction to oppression. That's what it is in terms of you talking about hostility. No, it's not really hostility. It is reasonable, observable, and realistic and responsible to have those kinds of feelings towards individuals that put their foot on your neck on a regular basis for sport.
Ms. Carter, you wanted to, I saw you wanted to respond to the question, then we'll move on to the last question. Just a quick response. I know you wanted to say something.
You know, I don't think most people quite understand what it is to respect others. Some people don't. Everything comes from respect. I respect you, you respect me.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
You know, and if you don't respect one another, then you tend to do bad things to one another. It's just that simple, I think. I could go through many things that happened, me serving the fire department, about fairness and respect and all that. You know, I left the fire department because of one thing. I asked for fairness. That was it. I wasn't stealing money. I was doing my job. I was doing everything. I was doing everything I was required to do and doing it better. I'm saying that because I know. But one thing got in the way. I said, this is not a fair process. I won't be a part of an unfair process. And so I ended up leaving the fire department because I wasn't going to win that fight. And so we have to deal with situations based on we think that everybody's equal, everybody deserves the same respect. That's bottom line.
Ms. Carter, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. First of all, for clarity, understand, and that word hostility, we established clarity about that, is that it's not about black people being hostile towards police. It's not that we have this initial violent feeling towards police officers. It's just that from our standpoint, we know them to terrorize our homes and our neighborhoods. Also, I do want to clarify that that feeling of fear and avoiding a police officer is not just about black men. Understand that this also comes with black women as well, and it's on another level, because it's not just about us possibly being murdered. It's not just about us possibly being murdered, but there's also that there's a possibility of being raped or being sexualized or in any way, shape, or form. And it's even worse, like if you're a mother, if you're a black mother and you have your children with you, so now you have this fear for your children as well. And I think a lot of great points were already said, so I won't reiterate them, but something that I want you to think about when you're saying, like, well, you felt like a possible solution is for black men to become police officers. There are two issues with that. First of all, black men from a very early age, as well as black women from a very early age, were criminalized. There are some black men and black women that can't even apply to be a police officer just over just ridiculous mundane warrants and all of that. As a matter of fact, in New York, they already tried that. They wanted to hire some black people to be police officers. Well, they found out a lot of them wouldn't even qualify because they had some type of record. Again, it goes back to that is racism, period. So even if that was a solution, we can't even do it because we're going to get denied because of some racism we experienced from a police officer. And then in addition to that, it was, you know what, I lost my train of thought, but we'll leave it there, and knowing, like, even if that was a solution, some of us would be denied that opportunity to police our own neighborhoods to begin with.
Yeah, it's not just police. When you look at a whole series of employment opportunities for black people, you have to look at a systemic problem. See, there's a whole thing, and I'll be talking a little bit about it tomorrow. A myth of meritocracy, in this country. The meritocracy, you get things predicated on merit. And that's just not something that's true. You can get things based on nepotism, cronyism. You can get things based on racism. You can get things based on a whole legacy of things that aren't predicated on merit. So again, when you talk about black people being criminalized for the most mundane situations and circumstances, let me kind of just explain a little bit, if I could, for a second. Let's say, for example, you are African American and you are in possession of a small amount of marijuana or what have you, and you get arrested for whatever. For the possession of marijuana and whatever else. And you're criminalized. You have a record or what have you. Depending upon what the prosecutor wants, it could go a whole bunch of different ways. Now, Todd, the white boy at WashU or what have you, gets high and drunk every day. And it just looks at it as a youthful indiscretion, and he goes on to become head of some company, Fortune 500 company. He's now the president of Emerson, and so a lot of times our European counterparts don't have the severity of penalty for acts that are done similarly situated that we do, and it'd be some simple drug possession or drug conviction charge that can have lifelong implications for black people in terms of now you have an issue that we're dealing with employment discrimination, housing discrimination, all kinds of things, education discrimination, and you will be perpetuated in a system of birth, poverty, and death. So it's really more of a systemic issue more so than anything else that needs to be attacked and addressed. But that Todd, the white boy from WashU, doesn't have anything to do with merit. It has everything to do with circumstance. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. So we do need to look at some wholesale systemic changes if we want to be honest with ourselves.
I'd like to move on to the next question, the last question of the civic discussion.
Yes. I understand this to be the civics panel, so I'm going to ask something that's related to citizenship, particularly to Ms. Carter and Mr. George. Often we use the language of human, subhuman, and I want to challenge us to use the language of citizenship. Okay, this is about constitutional rights as a citizen. So I might say I'm a constitutional conservative. But as a citizen of the United States, we are guaranteed constitutional rights with due process. And so under what circumstances can an agent of the government deprive someone of liberty or life without a judicial process? It's an extrajudicial killing in some cases. And so it's, yes, we're human, but I think that kind of abstracts it in a way. So we have a lot of our conservative fellow citizens talking about being constitutional conservatives. What we're talking about
Testing.
the enforcement of the Constitution. And so I'm curious what you think about in terms of shifting language, maybe from being language related to being human or subhuman or even respect to simply constitutionally following the law which guarantees due process for all citizens.
Where did you go to law school?
I didn't, sir.
Okay. All right.
So Ms. Carter, Mr. George.
Oh, okay. You dictate what's going on, but okay, go ahead.
Wow. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question, but we are all American citizens. Under the Constitution, we have the same rights. We should have the same rights as every citizen have. But in reality, we know that's not true. Mm-hmm. How, one of the problems we have, if some people may say it's a problem, I don't think it's a problem, but we are so easily identified. Right away, I'm on this board with the Jewish Dialogue Committee, and there's a little difference between us. They talk about being Jewish, I talk about being black. And one understanding that they don't have understanding is that I don't know who's who when they walk in the room. If I see a white person, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're Italian, Jewish, by religion, or I just see you as a white person. And immediately they know who I am. They knew who I am, and things started to change. Things really started to change. So that makes us unequal. If you go back to the United States, the President Obama, it shows you how unequal. He's not one of us. He's not a citizen of the United States. Is that what I got out of it? You lie in Congress. Those things tore me apart because I've never heard those things before. And so I don't know what we can do as far as citizens or there's some wording we can use, because I guess I try to point out we are automatically the boogeyman. Mm-hmm. People want a boogeyman, we're it. How do we overcome that? We can overcome that with the good people. The good people if we speak up, maybe they'll speak up. But we've got to speak up first, and we've got to stand up first and have the good people stand with us. We don't want them to be complicit in their quietness. We want them to stand up with us. But the language, I don't know how to change that language. It has to be in the heart, I believe.
Does Ms. Carter or Reverend Anderson want to answer that question?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because you're right. We do have our constitutional rights, but the issue is Americans that don't look like me, aka white people, European counterparts, they don't see us as entitled to that Constitution. So a lot of times you get people that, whether it's that they're in a position of power or they support those in position of power, when we are denied our rights, they just okay it. Just like, you know, Mike Brown, like he technically had a right to due process. If his crime was jaywalking, but we had an entire nation saying, well, it was okay that he was executed right there on the street. And the reason why they co-signed for it is because you have that officer that'll say, well, I was in fear of my life. And then in addition to that, you have a media that will put forth this image of, well, he was a criminal and he was a thug anyway. In addition to that, I also put the Constitution in context. Let's be real. When it was written, there was no one in the room that looked like me. So it's really hard to stand strong on the Constitution, knowing that, number one, we're still listed as 3/5 of a human being in it, and then number two, knowing that no one that looked like us even wrote it in the first place. So I guess I'm ending off in the same way. Like I'm not exactly sure how to change the language when the heart issue is still they don't feel like people that look like us are entitled to that Constitution.
Yeah. I would like to make a quick response to that.
Mm-hmm.
Well.
And then we'll wrap it up after that.
Oh,
sorry.
thank you. I'm sorry.
No, we're done. We're done with questions after he comments.
I'd actually like to respond to this question.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mr. E. Go ahead and respond to the question. Your question, I want you to pose it so that everybody, excuse me, when your question, I want you to pose it before everyone so everybody hears it and give you, and then if the panelists can stay afterwards, you can speak to them directly, just for the sake of time, and we're already 15 or so minutes over. Go ahead, Mr. E.
Just real quick, you know, I mean, it's just what Chief George and what Ms. Carter are saying are completely accurate. But you have to kind of live not in this pie in the sky reality. I mean, you have to look at things. You may be a conservative constitutionalist, you might be a textualist, you might be a strict constitutionalist, you might be any of those things or what have you. You've read it. You have some level of understanding. You may have even looked at a case or two and have done your analysis of it and therefore think that things are applicable in certain kinds of ways. You know, but the reality of the Constitution and the aspirations of the Constitution and the individuals that wrote the Constitution and the application of the Constitution are totally different things. When I was in law school and looking at constitutional law or what have you, I often looked at the disparate understandings in terms of the application of the Constitution and what was and the well-written strivings of it are just two totally different realities. So, you know, when you begin to look as we were, you know, chattel slavery, property slavery, we had the same rights as a duck or a chair because we were properties. Just in general, things did not necessarily apply to us. And even today, when you look at mass incarceration, when you look at the example that I use, those are real examples of what happens between black and white. And there's a real example of what happens between black and white because of individuals not looking at us through the lens of citizenship, not looking at us through the lens of equality, not looking at us through the lens of human beings. That's real. So we have a document that has strivings, that has aspirations, that have words, but how is that document really realistically applied to us and what are its impacts? You know, you might want to do a little further study.
And that's where we have to end it. But I want to thank you all for being here. And that concludes our first day with our conference on race, faith, and justice. Tomorrow. Can we give a quick round of applause for the panelists for being here and answering all the questions?
I do want to honor that promise I made. Could you go ahead and pose your question, and then if afterwards they can stay and answer that directly? Go ahead. You go ahead. You want to go ahead and pose it? You can do it. You can do it either way. Yeah.
We're talking about the Constitution. What I'd like to know is, you know, how we all of us respond to when we got people who are running for office who are saying we're going to get rid of the Constitution. I don't believe in the 14th Amendment. I don't believe in the First Amendment. I can respond to that. That's why I'm here. I called you because, boy, I don't want to see that.
I don't think that. I think that again, it's a difference between the Constitution, right? The document that was written, the purposes of the Constitution, the foundation of democracy, and the realities of democracy. Those are two totally different things, or what have you. And of course, you have individuals that have felt marginalized in the society, primarily white, or what have you. And the reality of the situation is that they want to see certain kinds they make these inflammatory kinds of statements as if they are the ones that are being marginalized and oppressed in a certain kind of way, or what have you. And they want to blow the whole thing up, shake everything up, make America great again, and all of those things, or what have you. And, you know, a lot of that is, you know, not realistic, and it's not predicated on anything but folly, fantasy, and a skewed perspective and different things in nature. But if we're talking about, again, citizenship, and we're talking about constitutional rights, you have to look at the difference between the paper and the reality of the Constitution. The paper of the Constitution is like excellent. It is an excellent document. If you look at the Constitution, you read it, analyze it, or what have you, look at the amendments, the rights, the whole deal, it is a wonderful document. But again, Derek Bell, rest in peace, former Harvard law professor, brother, tenured law professor, who wrote a book. It's called Faces of the Bottom of the Well. It's a really, really interesting book. He wrote several books. And one of the things that he talked about is even in terms of any kind of legislation, in terms of any kinds of laws, and we kind of see this thing to be true, that racism in it has a component of flexibility where it renders certain aspects of the law pointless as it relates to the application of black people. And a good book that probably would be good to read is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration of the Age of in the Age of Color Blindness. It kind of reflects a great deal on Derek Bell's work and very, very practical points where you see laws that are not evenly applied to individuals and the impact that it has on people of color in this country. So again, one of the things is you know, I would encourage people to study and continue to have positive dialogue like this, but in terms of those assertions that you have individuals saying they want to blow up the government and destroy the Constitution, more of that is just, you know, more foolishness than anything else. Because again, the individuals who should be saying that are the ones that in which the application of those very good strivings and aspirations are null and void.
Thank you, Mr. E. Can you give him a round of applause, please? I know Brendan wrapped it up for us, but I just want to thank everybody who was in attendance, those who came a little later. Either way, thank you for coming out. Earlier, a comment was made that there should be more people in this room, right? There should be, right? So please, if you can come back tomorrow, please stay for the rest of the duration of the conference. In addition to that, tell your friends, tell your family, etc. With that being stated, registration starts at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.